Today is a character-driven kind of tutorial that we're going to have. I'm going to be dealing with the art side of it. I'm going to try to make it simple, but giving you information for you to be able to use Cryengine to make very good-looking characters. Going through the basic of how to import a character, how to set it up, how to make a quick light setup so you can test it. So I'm going to start with a quick overview of what I'm going to do. I'm going to show you the result of what we'll do together. So don't worry, you don't have to do any art. All the assets are already done. It's more about handling them, having a look at what makes those assets, and then how it works in Cryengine and how you can kind of move on from there. So let's start with the... So my name is Abdenour Bachir. I'm a character art director at Crytek. I've been at Crytek for about 10 years, worked on pretty much all the big IP, in charge of most of the main character for all of IPs. So whether it was Rise or Robinson or Climb or Hunt, for example. That's me. Today I'm going to be touching on a couple of things that makes characters in Cryengine. PBR, how to prepare your asset. From DCC to Cryengine. DCC meaning Max, Maya. Today it's going to be Max, 3D Studio Max, yeah, which is a tool to model assets that we use as a base. And then making a quick in-game setup so you can look at your character and develop it from there, yeah? And then I'll make a quick talk about how we tend to make an asset and then deliver it to tech art. This part is very simple. So PBR, physically based rendering. I'm putting that slide here because it's a very important point nowadays, right? When we developed PBR with Nicolas Schulz on Rise, the idea was we had a lot of issues how characters were shaded in the old days in the game engines, yeah? For every scene, you had to make a special material so the character looks good in that scene. So if it's a night scene, you make material so you can see it in night scene. If it's a day scene, you make material for... And that was a big problem because that made a lot of materials. Pipeline was not very smooth because every time the game or the level was changing, you had to adapt the material for that scene. So this is what, when we started Rise, this is one thing we wanted to tackle. The other part of it is realism. PBR is just something that is used also in movies in a way that it tries to replicate material like it is in real life, how the light bounces on it and how much comes out of it. But for game engine, you have to do that in real time. So it is very complicated, so we do tricks, right? So PBR is a set of tricks to allow you to mimic reality, yeah, in a real-time engine. So with those tricks, one of them is to separate specular, diffuse, and gloss with Cryengine. This is the three things that we use the most to allow you to make materials that are either metallic or non-metallic. This is the big two separation, right? There is also the metalness that we don't use in Cryengine because actually it's a decision that we made with Nicolas Schulz because of me. Because metalness takes away a bit of the artistic part. In Cryengine, because you use spec, you are a lot more flexible. So just if people are wondering why we use specular instead of metalness, this is for that. It has the same result, but artists can make specific materials themselves without being constrained. And yeah, it's a very small distinction, but at the time, at Crytek, we tend to want to be in control of what we do, so we get the best results, yeah? So depending on the material you have, you can set certain values, like specular for water is the last one known was 43, 43, 43 values on specular, RGB values. And if you want to do the metals, like copper or aluminum, you have different values. You put those values and you have a range there. So even though it is precise values, you always have to keep in mind that it is faked, right? We are trying to fake reality. So in some cases, you have to play with those values a little bit. Like for skin, when we did it on Rise, the value was 52. Now it's 49 because we learned that it's a little bit better for the skin with the engine, yeah? It also is very important how the light is set in your environment in the game, because the light you set up will define the values. So if your light setup is not correct, the specular values that you do on your character, for example, will be not represented well. Specular, you set up your material, and then in the engine, light setup to work with the specular values that you set up, and you get something fairly realistic. That's a very basic principle of PBR. The gloss is basically to mimic the surface material. If you have a skin that is smooth, or if you have lots of rocks on the floor, the value of that material, you can fake it in the gloss. So the sharper the gloss, the more light is reflected. So it looks smooth and shiny, like chrome. The rougher it is, it mimics a lot of value, so the light kind of goes in different direction, it doesn't come back to your eye. That's roughness values. So we call it gloss. Other rephrased roughness, it's the same. So those are the most important things in PBR. So what it gives you is more realistic results. So here it's hunt. We are not using special shaders for hunts. It's just the illum, the basic shader. The eye is illum. The hair is the vegetation shader. So sometimes we use trick to get what we want. For high-end character, we have a special eye shader and a special hair shader that gives you more options for hair and for eye. We don't need to go into that yet, but I'm going to show you some results of that. Yeah. What it also does is one material fits all. So if you make a character, you make one texture, you make one specular, one gloss, your normal map. If you do it properly with the right PBR value, doesn't matter if it's a foggy night, daylight, it doesn't matter. It's going to work everywhere. I remember in the past on Crysis, every character had different material based on which scene, which level. That was a lot of work. And we had specular to get color on the skin. You never have color on specular unless it's metal with PBR, for example. And it allows you to have a unified pipeline. So character were done in a certain way in the past, and environment in a different way. Now character, environment, effects, everything is done the same way, and they all work together nicely. So unified pipeline. So more realistic, one material fits all, unified pipeline. This is what PBR gives you. It's important to stress that for Cryengine because this is how you'll get the best out of the engine. If you don't follow those rules, even though you have wiggle room to play with, you will have a hard time getting realistic lighting in the end. Yeah? Then we'll talk about preparing your assets. The DCC in your folder and texture and materials, and then the export. This part is the easy part. Our textures, usually, how do you save them? You create them as high-res as you need. If it's a simulation or if it's a small game, you create them at high, like for most of our assets, we take them 4K resolution. It's big, yeah? But then we save them into .tiff file, yeah? And when you save them in Photoshop or your other program, using TIFF file, you have these options that are given to you, like if it's a normal map. You can choose the type of file you want to save it. Here in this case, it's a normal map that have gloss in the alpha. We put our gloss in the normal map alpha. And then you can say, for PC, I want it 4K. For Xbox 360, in this case, 512. For PS3, 256. And then when you save it, you still have your TIFF file that is 4K, but when it goes into the build, it automatically chooses the resolution for what you set it up. So this is useful if you are working on multiple platforms. Yeah, and we have three types of texture, like I said: diffuse, specular, DDNA, that we use mostly for characters. Yeah, the diffuse is the albedo, which is the color of your skin, for example. The spec, we talked about it; it's a specular intensity. The DDNA is the normal map plus alpha. Normal map, alpha has the gloss map. Yeah, we put the gloss map in the alpha. Code reason, apparently it makes the normal map sharp, but doesn't lose detail when you have the gloss. And that's all we're going to use for character. We have a lot of other files, but it's advanced. It's if you want to do a wrinkle map, if you don't want to do MSC for translucency and all that. But I think during that core, it's not necessary to go through that, yeah? The materials that we are using, illum shader for general use. It's used for everything. It has a SSS option, screen space reflection and all that. And it is pretty good. This is what we use for all our assets at this point. Human skin shader, it's a shader that was used during Rise. The human skin shader have the blend maps for normal maps, the translucency for the ear. It's got a melanin option for the skin color. And then we have the eye shader. This is a complex shader, the eye shader, very complex. It's got a lens distortion, iris self-shadowing, SSS approximation, complex stuff that you can look at it if you do very high-end characters. But when you understand the setup, it's fairly straightforward. So the last point that is related to character, we'll do an in-game setup, making a quick level, importing the asset, material setup, and just look at how you look dev, that how you export and import quickly, because the iteration in Cryengine is very fast. Yeah, you save, it updates. Yeah, and then just how we hand over assets to tech art. So that part also is very simple. So this is what we'll be looking at today. So let's just take off the helpers. So what is that? It's a demo asset that was done a while back for Cryengine. It is not considered main character. It is not considered low NPC. It's in between. So it has some shaders that are for the high character, like the eye shader, the skin shader, human skin. But we don't consider that a main character. Yeah, main character have much more complex things going on, like on Rise, for example. But it's good enough for you to understand what it takes to make something look fairly realistic, yeah? So as you can see, it's got a lot of things that we can look at here. So when you get closer to the eye, for example, you have the eye wetness, you have the lens distortion, and you have like self-shadowing and SSS and all that stuff. The resolution of the skin, for example, is 4K. I mean, there's high resolution textures. Some of them are low. I mixed them to show you that the difference you can have, yeah? But it can handle very high-res textures. So if you do very high-end characters, you won't have any problem with that. So I set up this scene fairly quickly, and I'm going to quickly show you what it has. So what I'm doing right now, I'm just going to change the FOV of the camera. The natural FOV that people usually use is 55, but for cinematic, it's a little bit more closer, especially for character. It's between 31 to 42, 45. So you have less distortion, the nose is not as big and all that. But when you want to look around the scene, it's good to go into camera. You can change your FOV here, and you have presets, and you can just make custom, like a 5. And I'll show you what I use it for usually. Nowadays I don't use it much, but when I'm doing very high detailed asset, when I look at my asset, I go to camera FOV 5, and now you're getting like super close, yeah. And you can see like the iris, the depth of it, everything, yeah. And then I can tweak, I can adjust easier. So this is a cool trick if you want to get close to your asset and really detail it. The other thing that is important, I set up a quick background. It's a very simple, it's just a cube with subdivision, yeah, nothing fancy. You import it, you put a simple gradient texture, and you have a room a little bit nicer than a basic empty level, and you can do that very quickly. There is a cube map, voila. Cube map are very important. You use them once you've prepared your scene light, and you capture the cube map, so the reflection on the character take into account your light. And what we're going to do is we're going to import the assets in the level, set up the light, set up the cube map, and then play with it. Update the texture a little bit, and I think that will be more than enough if we manage. So, while we are in folder structure, might as well give you a quick reason why folder structure are so complex. So usually, when we do characters, we have a very set folder structure, and the root of that folder structure is in characters. In the old version of the engine, we used characters in objects here, yeah. Nowadays, characters is at the root. So it's not an object anymore. So just ignore that for that part. We are just doing it because all the assets were put here. But normally, we use character folder in the roots for clarification, yeah. Then in the character folder, we split our folders in usually rig. And depending on your rig, you will have then the assets, whether it's body, heads, etc. Yeah? It's important that you keep that in mind when you do your folder structure, because it's going to simplify your pipeline down the line. And like in our case, we separate heads from bodies, and this is why head is a separate thing. And then they are combined when we do our assets for the game later. Yeah? So the body and the head, usually we work separately, especially if it's a high-end asset, yeah? If it's a cinematic character. If it's a small NPC, it's usually a full because we don't do face separately. But for characters, face separate, body separate, combined later. And then in our folder for the assets, in our case, artists, yeah, we split it in the root, where you have your CGF, your CDF, where sometimes the tech art export their CDF. We have the material file, and then we have a texture folder. We separate that just for it to be clean. You can have your texture here if you want. But we have so many assets, we try to split them up so it's easier to find what we need. And in the texture folder, the PSDs folder. And if you notice there is an underscore PSD, it's because everything that you put with an underscore is not processed by the build. So that's why it's useful for us. So we can have the folder PSD and Cryengine will not bother with it. And then in this texture folder, when you save a texture, you have your normal texture file, your Cry asset file, and a PNG for the basically the icon. Yeah. So now that we have all of you in Max, let's have a quick look at that. What I'm going to do now is, as an artist, when I start a character, when I want to test a character, I'm setting up a certain file structure. I don't need to have a clean file. I don't need to have all the rules that I would have when I'm going to give that file to TechArt. So what I'm going to show you is how to quickly prototype an asset. So the two things that I use are dummy assets. You have helpers, yeah, and then you have a dummy here, yeah. And when you click on that, you're going to be able to create this big cube. It's basically just a helper. It doesn't have any kind of information aside for it being a helper, yeah. You can then move it to center of world. You have to picture it as it's a pivot. It gives the engine the information of where the center of origin is for the asset you're doing. And what I do is, if I want to make a sphere, for example, or box, if a character, let's say I make a box here, and I put it as well. So we have our box. We can also create a sphere. Same process, right? There's a sphere next to it, yeah? And if you go into utilities, Cryengine exporter, you can either pick or add selected in the Cryengine exporter to select the geometry you want to export. So if it's one asset, usually you just put your asset, add it to the exporter, and then export node as CGF. You have different options here: character file, skeleton, skin, CGA, anim. But the one that we are using is CGF. It's the basic asset file that we use in Cryengine. And then it creates a file, .cgf, that you can then open in Cryengine. Yeah? So we'll just do that very quickly. Put maybe the cube at center. Here at the bottom part, you can just put 0 and double clicking and then 0, enter. And we leave the sphere outside of the view, yeah? Now we have two assets. One has a center of origin at 0 and one is 71,499, further away from world origin, yeah? Now if I select those two and click add selected here, yeah, they appear here now. So if you export it, it's going to export it. Okay, I don't want to export the head, but it's exporting all the files that you have there, yeah? And it's going to export them because I didn't set up a path exactly where the max file is. What you can do is choose a place where to save those things. But right here, you can select a path where you want it to go. But we don't need to do that yet because it's okay that it is in the same folder. If we go and click Show in Explorer now, here, it's going to open the path where you exported it, yeah? And in this case, it's the same as the max path. It only exported the head here. It didn't because I canceled the export before. If you only export the two little assets there, they're going to appear here. So we have box CGF, box Cry asset, and sphere CGF, and sphere Cry asset. So, well, we exported our first asset, yeah? Notice we didn't set up material, we didn't set up anything. We just have two assets, one at the center, one not at the center. Now, let's go and open Cryengine. In File, New, Level. You can name it Demo and press OK. This will appear. So usually when you create for the first time a level, this is why you make your base setup. But it's okay if you mess it up, you can change it later on, yeah? Just for us to start. What we want to do is the levels just to test a character. So we don't need big textures and big, so we're going to put everything to minimum. So height resolution 128, texture dimension 512, tick off high quality terrain texture, we don't need it, and then press OK. And this is where you start. So let's set up the small one here. So it's okay for our size, what we are doing. It's fast enough, it's not too slow either. Now, the asset browser. Here you have the folders that are in your project. And here, our character assets are in, right now, objects, yeah? Characters, human, heads, and in heads you have head A. Here you have a couple of files, let's ignore them for now. We want to look at our sphere and our magical box. So if you go into work file, even though it's an underscore, it's still, you can still go take it because we are in editor, right? It's not in the build. And there you have max. And here you're going to see box, sphere, our two assets. So let's bring them both here, the box and the sphere. And now if I press 1, you're going to have the basic transforms, yeah? And one thing you notice, even though the sphere was outside of world center, its pivot is still in its center in the engine. The pivot is here, but the ball is not there. So it's important to understand that, especially with characters, because pivot placement and all that can rotate character or they can be in different places. So Cryengine take into account the placement of your asset's pivot, yeah? Not the asset itself. If the asset goes away, as long as the pivot is in your asset, it's going to keep that as the center when you import it. Now let's do something to break that. If I take the sphere, you go into hierarchy, affect pivot only. If I right click, put it to world, this is where the pivot is right now. Currently, it's with the ball. But if I turn that into 0, so what I did is the little select and move icon on top left, you right click on it and you're going to have this move transform type. Here we're going to put 0 and 0. The sphere didn't move, but the pivot moved to origin. It's a simple thing, but it's important to understand, so I want to go through that first. Now you go again into the pivot option and tick off affect pivot. Yeah? And now we have a sphere with its pivot in the center of the world. Yeah? Here. If I re-export with this new change, yeah, it moved the ball. See the difference? So when you have issues where your asset is not where you think it is, it's often the pivot, yeah? So if we do the same thing with the face, and the reason I showed you the dummy is now if you put the sphere and the box in the hierarchy under the dummy pivot is what Cryengine will care. So if your sphere has a different pivot or the box has a different pivot, the dummy is a pivot that matters. So you can export things with any pivot you want and still be in charge of the main pivot. So this is just a trick. That's why I'm using dummy. That's why I wanted to show you the dummy pipeline here in Max. So in our case, I have a dummy here, and I have head, eye overlay, the head geometry, eyes, eye water, tear duct, teeth, tongue, everything under the head dummy. And that's why it is important to understand that, because the eye, for example, their pivot is in the center here. The eyelashes as well, the hair as well, the face is at the ground. Pivots are really important in Cryengine because the further away you are from the pivot, the less precise the geometry is. So especially if you have a very big asset, if you have a big environment, you want the pivot in the center. For characters, if we do very close up, and when I want to test like screenshots or having a look at what my asset does, I put the pivot in the center as well, especially if it's a high-res asset, because you can export millions of polygons from Cryengine when you do tests, for example. It's no problem for Cryengine. So this is just a little trick that I wanted you to know. So now we take that into account, and we have the head hay here, yeah? You select your head hay dummy, you go into your Cryengine exporter, and you press Add Selected. And when you're ready, you can just export it, and when it's exported, go in the engine again. So one thing you notice is everything has replaced me, yeah? Because even though they are materials, they are not hooked together. So let's take characters, human, heads, head A. So we can move it a little bit apart, just give us a little bit of space. You can rotate it if you want. Next step is we want it to have a material. Same for the box and for the sphere. You can make a material in Max and export that material. I don't do that because we use Max and Maya and sometimes you can have some problems. In general, what I do is create a material in Cryengine and then sync it in Max. So making the material, making the texture link and then sync it to Max. And then you have your material in Max, and you apply it. Then when you export it, you won't have red, you will have the material. If it's a CGF. With character file, it doesn't matter, because it's a skeleton you export and it has all the information in it. But with CGFs, which are assets, like for environment, they need to be linked. And to be linked, need to be applied in Max or in Maya. And it's just a case of how you want to do it, in Max or in Cryengine. I prefer doing it in Cryengine, so it's cleaner, and then sending it to Max and apply it. So if we open the material editor, you have two material editors here. Some people like the new one, some people like working with the other one, but I'm going to be showing with the legacy right now, because this is the one I use the most personally. Yeah, I'm old school. And it has a cool feature, which is pick material. So that's why I'm using it mostly. It's just because of that little feature. So in here, you also have in material editor legacy, you have like the folder structure. In the new material, if you're using the one, you just use the asset browser. Yeah, and then you select the material you want. It's actually probably simpler. So we go into the same folder. And here there is like a material that is already done, which is mat head A, in the folder of head A. You can put the material wherever you want. We tend to put it at the root of the character folder. So how do we create a material if you didn't have one? You have a add new item here, or you can take something that's already existing and duplicate it. I tend to duplicate. I'm going to show you both. So if you start a new one, it pops up a place where you want to place it, basically, and the name. So let's call it demo box. And I'm going to go into the same folder as the Max file for now, because this is where I was. I'm going to save that. We have now a material demo box. And same as before, it's a replace me because the material is not set up. So now I have the demo box material selected. And I'm going to take the material out so you can see the full view of it. You have different areas here that defines the material. Here you have the shader type, which is currently Illum. Like I said, you have different ones you can select. They are all based off the Illum. It's just the Illum base with certain difference that makes the eye or the hair or whatever. Right now we just need the Illum. You have the area that is for opacity, transparency, and all that. Then you have the lighting setting, which is basically the basic diffuse color, specular color, smoothness, emissive, and emissive color. Those are like values you can change. You can just click on the color and you can play with the color. We'll get into it. But before doing that, we're going to go into the texture maps. You have diffuse. And we're going to set up a basic diffuse. So you click on the three little dots. And in the asset path, we're going to click in textures. And we're going to find a basic white diffuse color, just as a base starting point. This is what I usually do when I bring an asset. In search, type white. You're going to have a lot of texture, and take white diff, or white. Any of those two will work. And say open. Okay, so now we have a material with a basic texture, and let's start with the box because we called it box, yeah? And with the asset selected, there is a little button at the top of the material here, which says assign a time to selected object, yeah? So just click on it, and it's going to assign that material to your box, and now you don't have a replacement texture anymore. You have an asset that you imported, very simple, and you have a material in Cryengine. But you want that material in Max. So keep the material selected, go into Max while it's selected, press M for the material editor, select an empty material, which are the little gray ones, you know, just select one. And now in the Cryengine exporter, at the very bottom, you have a material area. You press sync material. You're going to have a window that asks you if you want to sync the current material. You say yes. And then it's ask you if you want it local or not. I tend to say no, because when you work in a production, you want your path to be the path of Cryengine and not your path, because your build can be in various folders and you're going to have the wrong path for your texture. So we click no. And what it does is now you have a Cryengine material with a Cry shader setup, and whatever texture you've already applied to it is already there. It's going for the DDS though. So if you would want to watch it in Max, you just need to turn the DDS to TIFF, or the folder that you're using, yeah? This is something that you need to keep in mind. If you don't see it in Max and it's white, it's because when you do the sync, it's syncing to DDS, not to the original source file. Okay? And now, when you have your box, okay, And now if you apply that material using this little assign material to selected to your box has the same material as in Cryengine. So now when you're going to export it, even if you give it to somebody else, as long as the material is in the right path, it's always going to come with the material. It's not going to be replace me. So we've exported the head before. So now we're going to try to make our little level with the light really quickly. If we go back to our material editor, and there is a matte head A, because the one that you imported was red, we could do the same thing, right? You make material, like if you take the demo, it would be the same. So material head A, if you look at it, it's got a plus next to it. And it's got a lot of material IDs there, yeah? So the way you do that is if you take your demo and right click, you can convert to multi-material. If you know Max, you can have like material with a lot of sub ID with different material that are referencing different material. We work like that in Max, but in Maya, you don't have that. It's just to keep things clean, so you don't have like 100 material that are separate. And what you do is with one material, you have multiple IDs. So you can have a head and you have different parts on the same material. It's more efficient. And you just convert to multi-material. And then you can right click on this material again and set the number of sub-material. And then with that, you can say, my head has 6 IDs, like the eye, the face, and they are different material. And then I put 6. And then you have to apply them on the character as well, 6 different IDs. So now we have 6 IDs, and the matte head currently has 11. You have the face, you have the teeth, the iris, water, etc. Yeah? In Max, the same. You have the main material. If you look at the box one, it's just a normal one. If you go one up, you have the standard material, and here, standard, multi-sub-object. You can keep the old material as ID one, and now you have as many IDs as you want, and you can do the same thing as in Cryengine. It's just easier to do it in Cryengine because it keeps things clean, and you use your IDs how you're going to use them in your game, yeah, and then sync it. Yeah, I find it much more practical to do. And then those ID, the face ID is 1, the teeth is 2, iris is 3. If I go into my character, that's something a little bit more advanced, so I'm not going to spend too much time on it. If you go into polygon selection in your edit tab, which is here, edit polygon selection on your asset. If I select a face, it has select ID 1. If it goes and check with the material you assign and it finds 1, this is what is going to be applied. If I select ID 3, it doesn't have any on the face because it's entirely 1. If I select the collar, for example, and I select the face as well, it's got ID 10. So this one will be on the material 10 of your submaterial. That's that. Let's get back to our asset now. Now we have our head. Let's delete the box and the sphere. Yeah. If you do a sync and export it again, it's going to link automatically. But if you are too lazy to do that, in Cryengine, take the asset, material, select the material head, like we did before with the demo box. Select the head and press apply to selection. And now you have the whole textured head here right now. Now one thing to keep in mind is I applied the head material, yeah? So everything is applied and it automatically sorts which material goes where. Now if you want to test just the face on everything, you can select the head face ID and do the same, apply. It's gonna ask you if you really want to do that because normally you wouldn't do that. And now you have that ID assigned to everything. So if you want to test certain material on different IDs and you don't want to re-export, you can do that as well. Little trick. So back to our material, apply it. Boom. I'm going to close the material now. We don't need it anymore. We're going to go to our previous character file. Now let's try to make a scene. We have the head. In the same folder as the asset, there is a little asset called background. Notice that it doesn't come with replace me texture because it's already have a material assigned to it in Max, right? So this is the example of it. Drag and drop in there. Now, what we want is we want it to be in the same place, exact place as the head. So there's a little trick for that. When you select an asset and you're in move mode, for example, if you press P and then click on the asset you want it to go to, here the head, click on the head, it's going to go at the center of its pivot. We also want to be centered on our head rather than walking around. You select the head and in the help, just under the help, there is like this little button here, which is go to selection. So if you click on it, it's going to take you to that selection. It's going to center you to that selection. If you want to rotate on that asset, Alt and then middle mouse. Alt, middle mouse. And then when you click middle mouse and move your mouse, you can rotate like in Max. It's the same like in Max, yeah? You rotate around the head. It's practical when you want to check something from all angles, yeah? So we have head. We have a little cube that gives us some kind of environment. We're going to take the cube and the background and move it a little bit so we don't see the ground. So just move it up with 1 and then the Z axis, yeah? And go back into framing your head. So now we have a face, we have a background. We're going to put 2 lights. So in create object, component, lights. And here there is also an environment probe, so we need both, yeah? We're going to take a light, point light, drag and drop it here. And take environment probe, drag and drop it here. So we're going to use the same go-to trick, so we don't have to move it by hand. So we have the environment probe selected, press P, select the face. And if you zoom out a little bit and rotate down, you're going to see the probe is here. It's at the root where the pivot is. If the pivot was at the head, it would go at the head. Yeah? Maybe we need to rename them so we don't confuse them for something else. So rename your light to light red, for example. In the level explorer here, just call it light red. And you do the same thing for the cube map. So you select the cube map. So, this is the light actually. This is, actually I renamed the cube map light. Let me change that. The cube map, call it cube map. And then the light red, actually, even better, because we're going to make it red. So the cube map, we already moved it to the character. We're going to do the same thing with the light. Select the light. P, move it to the face, so the light is on the same area, and then move it up close to the head, and move it on the right side. And maybe a little bit forward. Now we're going to duplicate that light, and we're going to move it left. Control D, and move it. And then we can just press P and the light again, and then move it. We're going to rename that light. Instead of light red 2, we're going to call it light blue. Select the light red, go into the properties, and here in the color, just make it red. Do the same thing with the one on the left and make it blue. So now, select the head in the level editor and hide it. So if you select now the cube map, in the cube map parameter, there is a button called generate. When you press generate, the cube map will capture the environment around it where the cube map is. And it's going to capture everything. So if you have the head, it's going to capture it on it. And then it's going to be part of the reflection. So it's important that when you capture a cube map, you have the light how you want it. Yeah, because this is what's going to be projected on the surface of the character or the environment or anything you have. And you can bring back the face. And what you have now is the light from your light setup is projected onto the head and onto the cube map. So you have the light and you have the cube map reflections. What we can do is I can now put a different map to the cube map to show you the effect of a cube map if it's done with a proper light setup. So you select the cube map, and in cube map path here, yeah, you're going to have the folder in textures, PBS reference. This one is okay. Anyone would work. I just want to show you how cube map can have an effect on it. And you just take one of them, like maybe, let's see, this one. And you're going to see, like cube map that it is, it's a much more brighter cube map you can see here. Yeah, okay. And if you select the cube map and you click active or deactive next to in the properties, you have an active button, and you can see the effect of the cube map. So depending on the cube map, the way your character or your asset will react will be very, very different. So it's very important that when you set up a light, you have the cube map that goes for it as well. Now the last thing that I'm going to do is touching really quickly on the environment, because right now the sun is still above the head and it's down, so it looks weird, yeah? So in Tool, Environment Editor, what we can do is just select one of the presets, like Audio Demo, for example. Yeah, and if we move it around and get a light that we kind of are happy with, then you have a basic scene where you can look at your assets in a way that you can iterate on. So like we did before in Max or in Photoshop, it's the same. You change the texture, you save it, it's going to update. Okay, I think that's going to be it for me. But I hope it was useful. Thank you, guys.